Milling lumber isn't just about using big, heavy, noisy pieces of equipment, although that is a lot of fun. Sometimes it's about just getting through the surface grit, grime, and saw marks so you can see what you really have to work with. In fact, the process even starts before that. Let me walk you through the steps I take to turn rough lumber into beautiful work pieces that are stable and perfect for your project. You've no doubt seen this cabinet in the background in some of my videos, and I gotta tell you, this is probably the busiest cabinet in my entire shop. I'm in and out of this thing 30, 40 times a day, and for good reason. My music system is in here, and I've got to turn it off every time I'm shooting video, and then turn it right back on when I'm done. My hand wipes are in here, Kleenex are in here, my safety glasses are in here. I have a weather station in here. I look at that all the time. My camellia oil is here, and I wipe down everything with camellia oil after I'm done using it. This door takes a beating, and frankly, it's built about as cheesy and as simply as a door can be built. The plexiglass isn't even glued in. All I did, these are 1.5 inch wide rails and stiles, and I cut a groove to accommodate the plexiglass all the way around. Then in the rails, I cut a 1/4 inch long stub tenon to fit into the groove in the stile. And the glue is only in these 4 corners. And in 5 years, this door hasn't sagged, it hasn't warped, it's perfectly straight, just the same as the day I made it. And it isn't the joinery, it's because it's good wood. So how can you always be sure of getting the best, most stable, and good-looking wood for your projects? Well, there's 2 things I think you need to keep in mind. First of all, patience really is a virtue. And secondly, even though some people will tell you frugality is a virtue, it isn't when you're dealing with lumber like this. First, let's talk about patience. This lumber I bought some time ago, it's been sitting in my storage barn out back for about 6 months. About a month ago, I brought it into the shop to start acclimating, knowing that I was going to be using it on a project. And if you think this is going to be really fast getting this lumber ready, it's not. We have to be patient to get good, stable lumber. The second point is about frugality. When you're working with common, rough-sawn lumber like this, your yield is not going to be very high. A lot of times I get 50%, maybe 60% yield out of a board of wood that I can actually use in a project. And you're just going to have to resign yourself to that, but it's okay because when you buy lumber like this, it's significantly less expensive than already dressed lumber. So the first thing that I typically do on a board like this is I cut off the ends. The ends are always pretty nasty, and of course, it being ingrained, the end has a tendency to dry faster than the middle of the board, and a lot of times there's checking, cracking in the ends. Good way to test that is cut off what you're going to cut off and take that cut off piece and wrap it on a table. If it breaks easily, there was definitely a check in that piece, and you probably want to go back and cut off another couple of inches. Check that. Until you get to good solid wood that doesn't break easily, there's a check running through your board that you need to get rid of. The next thing that you want to do is just do an overall visual inspection of the board. First thing I noticed was a couple of pretty nasty knots in this board. So for the purpose I want today, I'm not going to be able to use this end. Now, yes, I will get some wood on either side of those knots that I'll eventually be able to use, but not for today's project. The other thing that I want to do and you always want to do this with rough lumber, is get a good metal detector and check for any embedded pieces of metal. And as you'll see, I found metal in this board. And I marked the location here to make sure I stay away from that area with my good saw blades. Don't want to ruin one of those. There goes all my savings on the wood. So at the end of the day, I then wind up with a section about this big and a section about this big. That's the width that I want for this project. So I need to see what the grain looks like. To do that, I use a block plane. Now clearly you could use a longer plane, but a longer plane will have a tendency to really want to flatten the board. And that's not what this is about. We just want to get the saw marks and the surface dirt off so we can actually see the grain and see if it's what we want for this specific project. After I did that, then I came back with a moisture meter. This is a Ligno Scanner D. It's really good, pinless. And all you got to do is just hold it on the board and take your readings. And I would suggest that you take readings in numerous places on the board and sort of go with the highest reading that you get. See, that's 7.8% there and 7.7% there. So this is in the right around 8% moisture content range, which is okay, but we really won't know anything until we do some further milling and get this board more down to size. That scanner scans 3/4 of an inch deep, and this is a 2-inch thick board. So as we continue to mill, we'll get better and better readings as we go along. So let's get to work on this board. All right, now on this board, I can tell that this end of the board was cut pretty close to where a limb was growing on the tree. And if you were looking straight down at this board, you'd see that it is angling off this direction. So I could straighten up one edge, but looking at this grain pattern here, this piece of wood is not going to be any good to start with. So what I'm going to do, this doesn't have to be incredibly straight, but I'm just going to mark a line here. Now, you could take this and put it on your miter saw, but I happen to think that's a little unsafe. My preference is this doesn't have to be a perfectly straight cut. I just do it with the jigsaw. All right, now the other end of this board actually looks better. Unfortunately, I've got this knot here, so I'm not going to really be able to use it for this project, but I'm going to go ahead and cut this out and mill this, and I'll be able to use it for a future project. I'm just going to cut off a little bit of the end to make sure I don't have any checking in the end of the board. And assuming that I don't, we'll be good to go. Solid wood, that looks good. All right, now I've got a knot down here towards the end of this board and a knot here, and the rest of this board is pretty good except for where we have that little piece of metal. I've got a saw around that. So my next cut is to cut off on the other side of this knot. Again, I will mill this and get some smaller pieces out of it, but for right now, for our panels for the doors, I'm looking for wider pieces that I can cut and make my door panels. So right now I'm going to cut this off. All right, on a board like this, my next step typically would be to go to the joiner and start flattening one face. However, this board is just a smidge over 8 inches wide, so I need to bring the width down a little bit. Now, if it was a lot wider, I'd probably go to the bandsaw, but this is just a little over wide. Plus, I have this kind of ragged edge here that you can see, chunks missing here. and then there's a big piece that's splintered out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the jointer, and I'm going to first joint this edge a few passes. Now, it doesn't have to be perfectly square yet, but getting this cleaned up will bring the width down to where I can then joint the face. So let's go over to the jointer and get started. All right, now this board this is more than a check. This is an out and out split that appears to stop right about there. Now I looked at the board on the back side and it stops right about here. So I'm thinking that if I cut it here, I should have good wood from here back. So let's take a cut off here and we'll take a look and see what it looks like. See? Well, it was pretty obvious that was split all the way through, and now that I'm looking, I can see that this split goes further than I thought it did. Let me show you that up close. Okay, the moral is looks can be deceiving, and you may not always see these checks and splits from the outside of the board. So let's cut a little more off and see if we can get to some good lumber. I've still got a little bit of a crack down here, so I got to take a little bit more off. Okay, I have now finally gotten past that crack and split. There's a tiny little mark there, but whenever I square up this end, that'll take care of that. If a knot goes all the way through a piece of wood, it's probably best just to cut it away and get rid of it and use what's on either side. But if a knot does not go all the way through, and if it's a hard knot and can be loosened up, one thing that you can do is just pry the knot out. In this case, this knot does not go all the way through, and we can mill this board safely without any chance of this flying out or damaging the cutter head. We may not get usable lumber right here, but we'll much better be able to tell once the board is jointed and planed. So in this case, I'm just removing this knot. Here's another knot that doesn't go all the way through. Let's just see if we can. Yeah, we should be able to pop that right out. I'm just using a cheap screwdriver here. Don't want to use one of my good chisels for something like that. And there we go. I have calculated the exact sizes of the doors that I need to make. 4 doors for the smaller vanity cabinet and 2 larger doors for the main vanity cabinet. Now I'd like for the panels in those doors, they're going to be walnut, and I'd like for the panel to be a book-matched pair, 2 pieces of wood per door. So what I've done is I've come up with the dimensions that I need to rough cut my lumber so that I have plenty and that it's big enough when they're glued up. For the 4 doors in the smaller vanity section, I need 8 pieces of wood. And each one of those needs to be about 6 inches wide by about 10.5 inches long. And for the 2 doors in the main vanity, I need 4 pieces of wood about 5 inches wide by about 21 inches long. Now with these dimensions in mind, I can rough cut my walnut stock to length, and it'll be a lot easier to handle on the jointer and in the planer. Now what I've done is I've used block plane and knocked some of the rough wood off so I could see the grain, and here's kind of what I came up with. On this board, from here to here is a section where I can get 2 book match pieces for the 10.5-inch door. Same thing here for my 22-inch long pieces. And then down here, I've got a section here I might be able to use for one or the other, and a section on the other side of this knot that I might be able to use for one or the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this board right here, and I'll have 2 pieces that are a little smaller, lighter, and easier to handle when I get to the jointer. Now this board, I've got a knot right here, but from here over, I've really got this nice grain pattern here, and this will make a nice smaller door for the small vanity piece. This piece is plenty big enough to take care of one of the taller doors, but could be reduced in size and used for one of the smaller doors. And then down here, between here and here, I've got the larger door. I've got a grain pattern I really like here, and I got a great grain pattern here for one of the smaller doors. So I'm going to split this board between these 2 lines, give myself a little extra room, and I'll have, again, 2 smaller boards to joint and plane. And this big wide board up here, it's not that long after I cut away the bad stuff on that end, so I'm just going to do this intact all in one piece. So make a couple of cuts here, and it's time to go to the jointer. All right, so squaring up this stock is really all about geometry. We have a perfectly flat surface and a fence here, and I've got a board that's cupped a little bit on this side. So as we go through, also this board's got a little bit of a rock to it, and what it's telling me is that I've got a high side here and a high side down here. As we run this board through, it's only going to take the cuts on those high sides underneath, and it's going to shave that off until every surface of the board is in contact with the table of the jointer, and that'll mean that it's a flat surface. You can hear this. Cutting on one corner, cutting a little wider, and cutting still a little wider here. And we should be able to see evidence of that. And there we go. We cut right here on the high side, no cut over there. We cut on both sides here a little bit where it was cupping, and we cut almost the whole thing at this end, so it was fairly flat down there. Now we'll take another pass, and we'll actually cut a little deeper, and we'll cut more of the wood. The jointer's sound will tell you a lot about the wood. And you can see we're completely flat up here. Got a little spot here and a little spot right on the end that's not flat yet. So one more pass ought to do that. And now we can joint one edge, and I like to make sure that my high sides are at the ends. That looks pretty good. Actually, either way looks okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to joint this with the grain running downhill. That way I don't get any tear out. We almost got that on the first pass. And there we go. We have a flat surface and a nice edge that's perfectly 90 degrees to this surface. Well, you remember me saying that patience is a virtue? I did say patience is, yeah. Patience is a virtue. And after milling one face and getting one edge square, I'm going to let these boards sit for 24 hours before planing the other side. The reason for that is with this little bit of milling, we've still released some tensions in the board and we've exposed some fresh wood to the air. And these boards are going to move. So before I plane them in a day, I will joint this face one more time to make sure it's perfectly flat, and then we'll plane the other side coplanar, and we'll be ready to work with these boards. Guess what? I got totally distracted by another project that I'm working on, and I wound up letting these boards sit for 3 days. But it turns out that's pretty good, because I flipped them over onto the one milled face to make sure there was no movement. And sure enough, if you take a look, I've got a little bit of movement. So these boards have warped just a little bit after being milled. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run these through the jointer one more pass. Then I'm going to start planing the other side coplanar to that first face to get these boards, hopefully, finally ready to use. All right, now basically what we want to do when we start planing is have the planer just barely come in contact with the thickest of the boards, and then gradually bring the cutter head more in contact with the wood and eventually get all the pieces to exactly the same thickness. We're basically skip planing this. And your boards may wind up looking something like this after the first pass. Well, that's my milling process in a nutshell, even though I'm really not finished yet. I probably could have gone another pass on the planer and cleaned up a little bit more, but I decided to go ahead and stack and sticker these to get some airflow around them, let them rest for a couple more days just to make absolutely certain I don't have any movement. Remember, we're going to be resawing these boards, and I need to maintain as much thickness as I possibly can because I'll have to joint and plane again after resawing, and I need to wind up with 3/4 inch thick boards. So in the next video, we'll get started with the resawing. We'll dress those panels, we'll glue them up into our book matches, and we'll get started with the rails and stiles for the doors. I look forward to seeing you in that video, and I really appreciate you watching this one.